Hello everyone and welcome to SplitSecond. This week we have the pleasure to collaborate with one of our greatest inspirations, the Laboratory Maniacs. That's right, if you don't know yet, Cameron is bringing the channel back to life and stronger than ever. If maybe you're new to Commander and haven't heard of them yet, you should definitely check them out, as they are the grandfathers of all cEDH content creators. We'll leave the links in the description below. Baal brought his new take on Kenrith the Returned King, Cameron is on Niv-Mizzet Scepter, Leite brought a Krark and Sakashima list based on Ken Baumann's list from Stacked EDH, and Sigi is on his old favorite Urza Scepter. Baal won the die roll and kept his first 7, with a Bloodstained Mire, a Mana Confluence and a Sea of Clouds for lands. Carpet of Flowers would be great versus 3 blue decks, Enlightened Tutor can be used to get Survival of the Fittest in this creature-based deck, Flamescroll Celebrant is a versatile silence effect as well as a hate bear that can actually have some use in this pod, and Hullbreacher is everywhere now. Cameron mulliganed once and kept quite a safe hand, with 3 lands, Arid Mesa, Fire Islet and Mana Confluence, one of which will be discarded to their max diamond. Rapid Hybridization is a good removal or something to pitch for an emergence Force of Will, while Gilded Drake is great to deny access to an early opposing commander. Leite is on the flood side with 5 lands, 2 mountains, 1 island, training center and a gemstone caverns that will be in play as the game starts. This will put him ahead mana-wise, which will allow him to wheel the table pretty soon, getting access to a new 7 and disrupting his opponent's mulligan plans. This spell can also be used to interact early if needed. Finally, Sigi mulliganed once and kept a rather slow but safe hand. Mystic Sanctuary might come in turn 1 so he can get access to his 2 drops with his second land, an island. Note that for this video all of Sigi's islands count as snow-covered ones, as you can see in his deck list. Green Monolith is a decent ramp and Sensei's Divining Top will help on card filtering, despite lacking fetchlands at the moment. Spell's Kite is great protection for Urza, while Narset Reversal can put him ahead in response to a tutor or in a counter war. Lastly, Wheel of Invention can be later used to fetch for one of the key artifacts to combo off. Ready for this match? As the game is starting, Leite announces he has pre-game actions, and the lucky man gets the Gemstone Caverns into play, exiling a mountain. Baal then gets to his turn and top decks nicely. He plays a Sea of Clouds and casts Serra Ascendant, passing to Cameron. He appreciates this as he plays a Training Center and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding an Arid Mesa. He then casts a Gilded Drake, and there goes that top deck. Leite gets to his turn and also plays a Training Center, but passes fully untapped. Sigi's top deck makes him play his island first and casts the Drawn Ponder. However, not liking the top cards, he actually shuffles before drawing. We're back at Baal and he plays a Bloodstained Mire that he cracks for a Bayou. He'd rather not play the Carpet of Flowers into open mana, as none of his opponents would be especially pleased with it hitting the field, and it could also deter them to play basics, so he goes for the top decked 3 visits, getting a Savannah. He then attacks Sigi before passing. Cameron plays a Mana Confluence and goes to combat, sending Serra eating back at its owner. On his second main phase, he casts a Solve the Equation for a Time Twister, in hopes to refuel and disrupt his opponent's plans. It's now Leite's turn and he plays an island, and follows with his main plan, Wheel of Fortune. Baal is sad by losing his carpet but fires his Enlightened Tutor. It resolves, so he grabs a Mana Creep to the top. Wheel resolves and then Leite passes. Sigi starts by playing a Scalding Tarn and then casts a Mistress Bauble. He then cracks the fetch for an island and casts an Everflowing Chalice for 1. He passes and on Baal's turn he starts by casting the Mana Crypt. He follows it with Tundra and casts Hushbringer. It resolves, so he casts Uro, which also resolves. Its sacrifice and draw trigger are both invalidated and he proceeds to attack Cameron to slowly try to nullify his life advantage. Maybe he'll get him below 30 before dying. He passes. Cameron plays an untapped Steam Vents, taking 2 and casts Mana Crypt. He follows it with Sol Ring and then casts a Pyretic Ritual. This way he is able to cast his commander Niv-Mizzet Parun. He goes to combat and sends Serra at Baal again before shipping the turn. Leite starts things up with an island and casts a Mana Vault. Without much else to do, he casts a Phantasmal Image that comes into play as a copy of Niv-Mizzet. He then casts a Jeweled Lotus and proceeds to cast his Sakashima, which resolves, and enters as a copy of Phantasmal Niv. It also copies Phantasmal Triggered ability, but he would rather go for that play and hope to draw some cards in the process and persuade Cameron to leave his 2 flyers to pressure Baal. With the last floating colorless, he casts a Rhystic Study and passes. Being last in turn order and after struggling through the wheel, Sigi feels like he can't just sit there and do nothing, so he plays an island and casts Urza regardless of Hushbringer. Rhystic Study triggers and he can't pay for it, so Leite draws a card and his 2 Niv-Mizzet trigger, pinging Baal twice. Urza resolves, not getting the construct, and he passes. Baal manages to win the crit roll. He goes directly to combat and sends Uro at Cameron, triggering. He gains 3 and puts a City of Brass into play. He then plays a Windswept Teeth, cracking it for a plateau. He casts his commander, Kenrith the Returned King, triggering and paying for Rhystic Study. He passes to Cameron, who also wins the crit roll. He draws and his Niv triggers, pointing 1 damage at the Phantasmal Niv, triggering him to be sacrificed. He keeps attacking Baal with Serra and then plays an island before passing. On his end step, Sigi casts a Mystical Tutor, triggering Cameron's Niv and then Leite's Niv and Rhystic, which Sigi can't play. Leite draws from Rhystic, pinging the Gilded Drake, then draws from his Niv, pinging the Drake again. Cameron feels like joining the cause to kill the Drake, but notices Baal's untapped mana just in time, so he simply targets Leite's Sakashima, triggering it to be sacrificed. Mystical now resolves, getting a dig through time to the top. We're now on Leite's turn and he takes 1 from his vault. He plays a Wooded Foothills and cracks it for a Volcanic Island. He casts a Lotus Petal and follows it with an Arcane Signet, and then casts his other commander, Krark the Thumbless. He ships it to Sigi, who plays a Flooded Strand, and then casts a Static Orb, triggering Rhystic Study and not paying. Cameron then responds by casting his own Dig Through Time, triggering his Niv-Mizzet and Leite's Rhystic, paying for it. Now, in response to Niv's draw, Sigi cracks his Flooded Strand and also casts his Dig Through Time, triggering Niv, then Rhystic as well, not paying again. Cameron draws and points 1 damage at Urza. Sigi's Dig resolves and then Cameron draws a card from his Niv, pointing another point of damage at Urza. Cameron's Dig now resolves, and still in response to Static Orb, he casts a Red Elemental Blast targeting Urza, triggering his Niv and Rhystic Study, which he pays for. This play means Sigi is in a lose-lose situation, since if he responds to it, Cameron will have the 4th draw needed to ping Urza and kill it regardless, so Sigi thinks for a bit and passes. Cameron points Niv's trigger at Urza still, since doing otherwise could prompt Sigi to react now, and then Red Elemental Blast resolves, and so does Static Orb, equally taxing all 4 players. We're in for a long game. Baal loses his crit roll and untaps 2 mana-producing permanents. He fails a land drop and simply passes. Cameron wins the crit roll again. He draws and points Niv's trigger at Krark. He plays a City of Brass and then casts a Gitaxian Probe targeting Baal. He triggers Niv and Rhystic. However, to the table's oblivion, Baal responds by activating Kenrith, reanimating Hull Breacher. It resolves, and now Cameron doesn't pay for Rhystic and Leite doesn't draw, and Niv's trigger is a mandatory one, so Baal gets 1 treasure from that. Probe then resolves and Cameron gets to see Baal's plans, before he gets another treasure. He keeps the 6/6 pressure and passes the turn. Leite untaps 2 lands, takes 1 from the vault, plays an island and simply passes. Sigi is reaping what he sowed. However, he plays an island and casts a Mana Vault. Just like that, he casts Urza again, and as everyone passes priority, he's back in the game. We're back at Baal and he loses the crit roll again. At this point, Cameron alerts the table Seedborn is in Baal's hand, which he ponders on casting. But he also has a Grand Abolisher that could protect that cast, so he goes for that. So Cameron also alerts the table of Deafening Silence and Eidolon of Rhetoric in his hand, in case someone else wants to prevent that. Abolisher resolves and he passes. Cameron's script slaps him this time around, and he draws triggering Niv and pinging Baal. He plays an island, casts a Talisman of Creativity and attacks Baal again with Serra. This time Baal jumps with Drake and then Cameron passes. Leite takes 1 from the vault and plays an island. He casts Sakashima and it resolves, entering as a copy of Krark. He passes, slowly trying to get to his endgame. In his end step, Sigi taps his Static Orb with Urza, so he's able to untap everything. He takes 1 from the vault in his draw step, and despite Hullbreacher, he casts his own Rhystic Study. He passes, and before Baal gets to his turn with Abolisher in play, Leite fires a Pyretic Ritual. Now things will get interesting. As it is Sigi's turn, triggers are put into the stack in AppNap order. Active player, non-active player. So Rhystic triggers, then Niv, and then both Krark trigger. Actually, both rolled in favor, so Leite gets 6 red mana. He then lets Niv's trigger resolve, so Cameron doesn't get a card drawn and Baal gets a treasure from that. He doesn't pay for Rhystic because of Breacher, and the original ritual resolves, getting him 3 red mana. He uses 2 to cast an Abrade targeting Grand Abolisher, triggering everything again. The first roll fails, sending Abrade to his hand, however the second one succeeds in copying it, and he keeps Abolisher as the target, so it dies. With Niv's trigger still on the stack, he responds by casting an Abrade again, this time targeting Niv-Mizzet, and everything triggers again. In response, however, Cameron casts a Narset's Reversal on it, triggering Rhystic and his Niv, which Baal gets a treasure from and Cameron doesn't pay for Rhystic. Narset resolves and he targets Hullbreacher with it. Now, at this point, Baal feels like Leite will try to keep his spell slinging, which eventually would result in Sigi and Cameron drawing quite some cards, so he responds with his Swords Plowshares, targeting Krark, triggering everything again. Leite responds by casting a Braid again on Niv-Mizzet, and there goes the triggers. Thank God Cameron helped everyone to visualize the stack with those blank cards, or we'd be losing ourselves in there. Both Krark triggers fail, so still in response to the Niv draw, Leite recasts a Braid targeting Niv, and everything triggers. The first one copies it successfully, targeting Niv again. The second one also copies it, so he changes target to Hull Breacher. Now hopefully we did a good job maintaining the stack cleared for you, but to better understand it, there are 2 Braids going Hull Breacher's way and 2 going Niv-Mizzet's way. Despite the fact that Hull Breacher will definitely die, Baal does pay 2 mana to put a counter on it and then 2 more to put another, which means that by spending these 4 mana he will prevent several card draws from Sigi and Cameron, and regain those treasures back. The stack starts clearing, and then Cameron responds to a Braid targeting Niv by casting a Dispel, triggering Sigi's Rhystic, Niv and Leite's Rhystic. No studies are paid for and Baal gets another treasure. The stack keeps clearing slowly with no further responses. Baal regains those treasures and then Hull Breacher eventually dies to the other Braid. Then Sakashima's Krark actually copies the original bounce to Braid, dealing 3 more damage at Niv-Mizzet and killing him. And Krark's trigger rolls unfavorably. Leite pays 1 for the last Rhystic and then Cameron and Sigi draw their last cards before the turn is finally over. Baal untaps his Uro and Mana Crypt and manages to win the roll. He goes to combat and attacks Cameron with Uro, triggering, gaining 3, drawing a card, but no lands are being found. On his second main phase, he goes for his plan, casting Seedborn Muse, triggering Rhystic Study and not paying. But in the end, Sigi saves the table by casting a Force of Will, pitching a Gitaxian Probe. Baal passes, and on Cameron's upkeep he wins the crit roll. He goes directly to combat, sending Sarah at Baal, who now has no option but to champ with Hushbringer. On his second main phase, he plays a Dockside Extortionist, triggering both Rhystics and paying only 4 Sigis. Still, Sigi has it covered and casts a Pact of Negation, paying for Leite's Rhystic trigger. He plays an island and casts a Preordain, triggering Rhystic Study and not paying. Sad about his sequencing, as he bottoms 1 and draws a counterspell before passing. Leite taps and takes 1 from the vault. He plays an island and casts his recently drawn Dockside Extortionist, not paying for Rhystic. However, that Preordain eventually comes to some good as Cameron casts his counterspell, triggering and paying for Rhystic. Leite then proceeds to cast Mana Crypt, not paying for Rhystic again. He follows that with an Underworld Breach, still not paying no one's tuition. It actually resolves, so he proceeds to escape Dockside Extortionist with his Petal and last floating mana. Sigi draws from Rhystic, but still no answer was found, so the future is bleak. He gets 11 treasures and after pondering his options, he goes for a Hull Breacher. He does pay for Rhystic and it resolves. So he then casts a Wheel of Fortune. It triggers Krark and he loses the flip. The table rejoices, but he still has mana to recast it, and so he does. Krark triggers and he loses the flip again. The match will go on. On his end step, he sacrifices Underworld Breach and Sigi taps his Static Orb with Urza so he can untap everything. On his upkeep, he pays for the Pact trigger and then loses 1 from the vault at the draw step. He plays an Ancient Tomb and doesn't feel safe to force a win, so he casts a Gilded Drake, paying for the Rhystic trigger. It resolves and he takes out Leite's Hull Breacher. He then casts Lotus Petal and follows it with an Ether Spell Bomb before passing. Baal loses the crit roll and fails to draw land yet again. Cameron does say he won't attack him anymore since his deck can't go off with Hull Breacher on the field, so that Sarah is aiming straight at Sigi's head right now. Baal prefers to simply pass and not put more stuff like a Deafening Silence on the table since all eyes are now looking at Sigi and he still wants to reanimate that Seedborn to regain some life. Cameron wins the crit roll, plays a Sulphur Falls and swings Sarah straight up at Sigi before passing. Leite also wins the crit roll, takes 1 from the Mana Vault and moves directly to combat, sending Gilded Drake at Sigi since everyone is afraid that Sigi top decks a Will or gets 1 from Urza. He then casts a Sparkle Double, not paying for Rhystic. It resolves, and as it enters, he copies Dockside Extortionist, creating 13 treasures. He follows that with his Krark, paying the 1. He then casts Twin Flame, paying 3 extra to have 2 targets, Krark and Sakashima's Krark. He doesn't pay the 1, however, in response to the triggers, Sigi responds by casting Counterspell on the original spell to prevent it from being bounced. The first roll fails, but he wins the second, so without access to the original spell, he changes the targets to both of his Docksides, creating 2 more Docksides, for a total of 26 more treasures. With his Wheel of Fortune and another card in hand, he simply passes. Sigi takes 1 from the vault and ponders his options. He cracks the Spell Bomb to draw a card, and he feels like this is the window to go off. He plays an island and casts a Transmute Artifact. He pays 2 extra as he gets an Isochron Scepter. Imprint goes on the stack and no one responds, so he exiles Dramatic Reversal. He then activates it and holding priority taps Petal and Static Orb for extra mana. With everything mostly covered, Sigi didn't remember he was playing against SplitSecond, as Baal casts a Trick Bind. He targets the Scepter's activation, paying the 1. With his plans foiled, Sigi uses his floating mana and activates Urza once. He reveals a Cyclonic Rift, which he points at his own Gilded Drake in Leite's control. He then passes and the table has one turn before he gets to go infinite with Urza or Saxing with the Orb again. Baal keeps on taking damage from the Crypt. Uro's trigger is mandatory, so he doesn't even attack and instead casts a Meddling Mage, paying for the Rhystic trigger. As it enters, Baal names Chain of Vapor, taking into account that Lonely Island from Sigi. He then activates Kenrith to bring Sidmar Muse into play and it resolves, so he passes. Cameron's Crypt has a change of heart and slaps him for 3. He plays his Cephalid Colosseum and casts Niv-Mizzet. We actually miss a Rhystic's trigger, but Cameron could and would pay for it. He then attacks Sigi before passing. On his end step, Baal activates Kenrith to gain 5 life, and then again to bring Hushbringer to the battlefield. Leite gets to untap everything and even pays 4 to untap his Mana Vault. He loses the crit roll and plays an Ancient Tomb. He passes, and on his end step, Baal activates Kenrith again for 5 more life and then reanimates Flamescroll Celebrant. That might be helpful enough for Sigi not to win straight up. On Sigi's upkeep, he activates Scepter, so he can untap his Mana Vault, taking 1 from the Flamescroll Celebrant. He then draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. In a tight corner, he feels he must dig for answers with Urza, which are limited due to Flamescroll Celebrant. Note that by this time we had missed 2 life lost from an Ancient Tomb activation, so we all thought Sigi had 2 more life, and played accordingly. We only found this while editing, and it didn't change the outcome of the game, so we chose to showcase it anyway. He activates Urza, taking 1 and revealing a power artifact. He then floats mana with Urza and activates Scepter, taking 1 again. He then activates Urza again, taking 1 more and reveals a Fabricate, which he casts, triggering Niv-Mizzet, but with Hullbreacher on the field he gets the treasure. He tutors for a Witching Well and casts it. He scries 1 to the bottom and 1 on the top, and then casts Power Artifact on the Witching Well to activate it to draw 2 cards. He takes 1 more from Flamescroll and both him and Baal forget about Hullbreacher on Baal's graveyard. He then activates Scepter again, taking 1 more. He activates Urza once again, taking another point of damage. He reveals a Trail of Evidence, which he casts. He does another iteration of Scepter, taking 1 and Urza taking 1 more, and reveals a Winter Orb, which he also casts. He then activates Scepter again, taking 1 more. He then activates Urza again, taking another point of damage, and reveals an Urza's Bauble, so he casts it. After some thinking, Cyclonic Rift on the bin, Chain of Vapor uncastable, only Reality Shift can save him now, so he goes for it. Urza activating taking 1 and reveals a Mana Crypt. He casts it and activates Urza one last and decisive time, and he reveals a Swan Song, so he sadly passes. On his end step, Baal activates Kenrith, gaining 5 life, and then again to bring Grand Abolisher to the battlefield. He finally manages to win the crit roll. He goes directly to combat and sends Hushbringer at Sigi and Uro and Kenrith at Cameron. Uro triggers, getting Sigi a treasure and gaining Baal 3 life. No one blocks and Sigi dies, returning Hullbreacher to Leite's control. On his second main phase, Baal casts a Deafening Silence, paying for Leite's Rhystic, and follows it with an Eidolon of Rhetoric, paying the 1 again. Before passing, he activates Kenrith, putting a +1/+1 counter on Flamescroll Celebrant. As Baal is now tapped out, Cameron activates his Cephalid Colosseum targeting Baal, so he discards 3 cards and gives 3 more treasures to Leite's booty. Cameron loses 1 life and Baal discards 2 creatures to reanimate and an Imperial Seal. Cameron wins the crit roll once again, draws and sends Niv's trigger at Baal's face. He moves to combat, sending 11 flying damage at him. No blocks are declared, and on his second main phase he fires a Rolling Earthquake, X = 4. He does not pay for Rhystic, so Leite can eventually draw into some answers, and gets a treasure from that. Baal responds by activating Kenrith, gaining 5 life, and then activates him again to put a +1/+1 counter on Seedborn. Leite then responds by casting an Opt, triggering Niv-Mizzet, gaining himself another treasure and triggering both his commanders. Both rolls come successful, so he copies the spell twice, and bottoms the card 3 times before drawing each time. Baal then activates Kenrith again and puts a +1/+1 counter on Eidolon of Rhetoric. Half of the board is cleared and we're back at Leite's turn. He loses the crit roll once again, and despite the Rule of Life effect, he goes for a gamble, triggering Niv-Mizzet, to which Baal responds by activating Kenrith, returning Hullbreacher to the battlefield. In response, Cameron fires a Mental Misstep into Gamble, triggering Rhystic Study and Niv-Mizzet. He draws one and hits Baal in the face, and doesn't pay for Ristic so Leite can draw. The game has been going for almost 4 hours, and at this point both players are digging for a Cyclonic Rift. However, there was a lack of communication around it, so the tutor is countered. The last Niv trigger gets Baal a treasure and Leite passes. On his end step, Baal fires a Vampiric tutor, triggering Niv and getting another treasure. He goes for a Possibility Storm to try to end the game. He still activates Kenrith to gain 5 more life before his turn. He keeps losing those crit rolls and goes ahead casting his Possibility Storm, which resolves. He goes to combat and sends everything at Cameron, triggering Uro, gaining 3 life and drawing a card. Cameron takes 19, putting him just below the threshold for Sarah to be a major beater. He activates Kenrith to gain 5 life just before passing. Possibility Storm paired with Eidolon of Rhetoric means no one else can cast spells from their hands. As the enchantment triggers, they are replaced for another spell to be cast, and due to the rule of law effect, no more spells can be cast. However, Krark can actually bypass this, since he can be cast from the command zone, not triggering, and whenever Leite would cast an instant or sorcery spell from his hand, both Krark and Possibility Storm would trigger, and a copy from Krark is created on the stack, so it can bypass this restriction. So with this in mind, Baal activates Kenrith on Cameron's upkeep to bring Meddling Mage to the battlefield, and names Krark the Thumbless, so his opponents scoop to the lock. GG. Thank you for joining us for today's match, everyone. This was a really long and intricate match. We hope you enjoyed this video as much as we did. If somehow you haven't heard of the LabManiacs, go check their channel. On the top right and in the description below you can find the links to it. We'd like to start the credits by thanking our current patrons, and especially Izanagi, Stefan, TJ Rap, Mike Purr, Ajimo, Uncrustable, Drunken Housecat, V, RJ and Heated Chill, our stack breakers. If you want to support us, you can do so by liking this video, subscribing or by becoming a patron yourself. If you want to go through other Commander adventures, click one of the videos on the right. If you want to talk with us about our games or other EDH related matters, join us on Discord. Join us again next week for a new set of Commanders and more decisive plays. See you all then!